The Bogeyman in My Bed, a story. EJ had always heard the whispers about the Bogeyman. His friends at school warned him, and his parents told him to stay in bed. But EJ was different. When the night came and the moon cast shadows across his room, he would sit on the edge of his bed, waiting. Everyone else feared the Bogeyman, but not EJ. He knew what the others didn't. The Bogeyman wasn't just a shadow outside the window. He was an invitation. One evening, as the wind howled and the trees creaked in the dark, EJ stared at the window. He felt the familiar chill, but this time the air wasn't just cold. It was heavier, like it was holding its breath. Then, as if on cue, the Bogeyman appeared. His pale, twisted face pressed against the glass, his hollow eyes staring with an unnerving intensity. But EJ wasn't afraid. He did what he always did. He opened the window. The air turned freezing as the Bogeyman slithered inside. He didn't crawl or walk. He simply slid across the room like a shadow too large for the walls. His body seemed to shift and distort with each movement, and his breath was a whisper, cold and thick. "Good evening, EJ," he rasped, his voice smooth like silk wrapped around a knife. "Shall we get comfortable?" EJ nodded. His throat was dry and his voice wouldn't come. The Bogeyman's smile stretched unnaturally wide, revealing teeth that glimmered like shards of glass. "Good," he said, his fingers brushing the edge of EJ's blanket. "I like telling them. But do you know the best part about my stories?" EJ shook his head, his breath shallow. He wasn't sure he wanted to know, but the question hung in the air, demanding an answer. The Bogeyman leaned closer, his face so near that EJ could see the strange patterns in his skin, like cracks in old porcelain, blackened and jagged. "They don't end when I leave," he whispered. "They linger. They follow you, EJ. They crawl into your dreams and live there, forever." The words sent a shiver down EJ's spine, but he didn't look away. There was something hypnotic about the Bogeyman, something that made fear feel distant and unreal, like it belonged to someone else. "I like the way you tell them," EJ said finally. The Bogeyman tilted his head, his hollow eyes narrowing. "Do you now? Well, perhaps you'll like this one best of all. It's about a boy, just like you." EJ stiffened, but the Bogeyman didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, and just didn't care. He began the story, his voice low and rhythmic, like the beating of a dark, endless drum. "There was once a boy who thought he was safe. He believed the darkness was his friend, that the shadows meant no harm. So he invited them in, made them welcome. But the shadows don't belong to anyone, and they don't stay where they're not meant to be. They seep into the walls, the floors, the very air, until there's nothing left but them." As the Bogeyman spoke, the room seemed to grow colder, the air thick and heavy. The shadows on the walls stretched, their shapes twisting into forms that shouldn't exist. Too many limbs, too many eyes, all moving in a way that made EJ's stomach churn. "But the boy," the Bogeyman continued, his voice almost a purr now, "he didn't understand. Not until it was too late. Not until the shadows took him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of him but a story." EJ's heart pounded in his chest. The shadows were closer now, creeping across the floor, the bed, the Bogeyman himself. They licked at his skin, cold and damp, and for the first time fear prickled at the edges of his mind. "Is that what's going to happen to me?" he whispered. The Bogeyman's grin widened, his teeth gleaming like a predator's in the dark. "That depends, EJ. Do you want it to?" EJ's breath quickened as the shadows pressed closer. They curled around his arms and legs like tendrils, cold and sticky, leaving a strange tingling sensation in their wake. The Bogeyman watched him with those hollow, unblinking eyes, his expression unreadable. "I don't want to go," EJ said, his voice trembling. "Don't you?" the Bogeyman replied, tilting his head. "You opened the window, EJ. You invited me in. That means a part of you does want to go. You're curious. You wonder what's out there, beyond the stories." EJ shook his head, but the shadows seemed to tighten their grip, pulling him gently but firmly toward the Bogeyman. His chest felt heavy, and his thoughts were a whirl of confusion and dread. "Where would you take me?" he managed to ask. The Bogeyman's smile returned, slow and deliberate. "To the place the stories come from. To the space between dreams and nightmares, where the shadows live. It's not a bad place, really. Just different. A place for special children like you, EJ. Children who listen, children who believe." EJ tried to pull back, but the shadows wouldn't let him go. His bed felt like it was sinking, the mattress pulling him downward into something cold and endless. The room itself seemed to warp, the walls stretching into the dark, the familiar corners disappearing. "I don't want to," EJ said again, but his voice was weaker now, barely audible over the whispering shadows. The bogeyman leaned in, his face inches from EJ's. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said softly. "I'll leave you with something to think about." And then he placed a cold, spindly hand on EJ's chest. It wasn't heavy, but it felt like it reached inside him, brushing against something deep and unseen. EJ gasped, his body stiffening, and then the bogeyman withdrew, leaving a strange, hollow ache behind. "You'll dream of me tonight," the bogeyman said, "and tomorrow night, and the night after that. Each time, you'll understand a little more. Until one night, you'll leave the window open, and you'll be ready to come with me." The shadows began to recede, slithering back into the corners, under the bed, into the cracks in the walls. The room brightened slightly, but it was still cold, the air still thick. The bogeyman stood, his form elongating, his features fading into darkness. "Good night, EJ," he whispered. "Until tomorrow." And just like that, he was gone. EJ lay in his bed, trembling, staring at the open window. The moonlight spilled across the floor, pale and distant, but the warmth it should have brought was nowhere to be found. The shadows were still there, hiding just out of sight, whispering faintly. He didn't close the window. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he was too scared, maybe he was too curious, or maybe, just me, a part of him wanted to see the bogeyman again. As EJ drifted into an uneasy sleep, the shadows crept closer, their whispers growing louder. Somewhere far away the bogeyman was smiling.